Beer wasn't invented by a brewer. It was invented by bread, left out in the rain, that nobody bothered to throw away. 12,000 years ago, humans didn't drink the way we drink today. Water was often unsafe. Rivers carried disease. Wells weren't always clean. And nobody understood why some water made people sick, and other water didn't. At the same time, people across the Fertile Crescent were gathering wild grain, wheat, barley. They'd crush it, soak it, sometimes leave it sitting around in simple clay bowls for days at a time, because nobody was in a rush and nothing was refrigerated. Here's what nobody realized back then. Wild yeast lives everywhere, in the air, on grain husks, floating invisibly, landing on anything wet and sugary left out long enough. So when a bowl of wet, mashed grain sat outside a little too long, wild yeast landed on it, quietly, invisibly, and started eating the sugar inside the grain. That process produces two things: carbon dioxide, which makes it bubble, and alcohol, which makes it something else entirely. Someone, somewhere, found an old bowl of grain mush that had been sitting out for days. It was fizzing, it smelled strange, and instead of throwing it away, someone drank it anyway. That is the moment beer was born. Not a recipe, not a brewery. A forgotten bowl of porridge that fermented completely by accident. Here's a detail that sounds made up, but isn't. In some ancient cultures, people sped up fermentation using their own saliva. They'd chew raw grain, then spit it into a container. Enzymes in human saliva break down starch into sugar, which gives wild yeast even more fuel to work with. It's genuinely disgusting by modern standards. It's also genuinely one of humanity's earliest pieces of food science, discovered with zero understanding of enzymes, zero understanding of yeast, and zero understanding of chemistry. Just repeated trial, repeated accident, repeated habit. But here's the twist most people get wrong. Beer wasn't a party drink at first. It wasn't invented for fun. In many early societies, beer was safer to drink than water itself. The boiling and fermentation process killed off many of the bacteria that made water dangerous. Alcohol content, even low alcohol content, helped stop harmful microbes from growing. So entire communities, men, women, even children, drank a thin, low-alcohol beer daily. Not to get drunk, to survive. At Rekefet Cave in modern-day Israel, archaeologists found evidence of beer brewing dating back roughly 13,000 years. That's older than confirmed evidence of bread at some of these same early sites. Which means, in at least a few cases, humans may have started fermenting grain before they ever baked it into bread at all. Think about what that actually means. In a world with no plumbing, no filtration, no understanding of germs, beer was one of the few reliably safe things to drink. It was calorie-dense. It was hydrating enough to get by on. And it didn't make you sick the way untreated water often did. Beer wasn't a treat back then. It was closer to a survival tool, hiding inside what looked like a spoiled bowl of grain. Thousands of years later, in ancient Sumer, beer had become such a normal part of daily life that people wrote poems about it. One surviving text, known today as the Hymn to Ninkasi, is a poem honoring the Sumerian goddess of beer. Here's the wild part. Hidden inside that hymn is an actual, functional beer recipe. Step-by-step instructions for making bread specifically to be crumbled into water and fermented into beer, written down thousands of years ago, disguised as a religious poem so common people could actually memorize it through song. It may be the oldest known beer recipe on Earth, and it survived not in a cookbook, but in a hymn. And Sumer might not even be the earliest chapter of this story. At a site called Jiahu in ancient China, archaeologists found pottery residue suggesting a fermented rice, honey, and fruit drink dating back roughly 9,000 years. It's not exactly beer the way we'd define it today, but it's close enough to matter. Which means the same basic accident, sugar, water, wild yeast, time, may have happened independently in completely different parts of the world, long before anyone in these regions ever met each other. Beer wasn't just consumed, it was used as payment. Workers who built some of ancient Egypt's most famous structures, including labor connected to the pyramids at Giza, were partly paid in beer rations, alongside bread and other basic goods. A functioning, organized labor system, partly running on a drink that started as an accident. Beer wasn't a luxury reserved for elites in these early economies. It was closer to a wage. A basic part of daily survival for ordinary working people. Even temple workers and soldiers received regular beer rations as part of standard compensation, recorded carefully by officials whose entire job was tracking exactly how much beer was owed to whom. This part connects to something else entirely. Some of the earliest known written records on clay tablets aren't myths or laws. They're beer rations. Simple accounting, tracking exactly how much beer each worker was owed for each day of labor. In other words, one of humanity's very first uses for writing wasn't literature. It was keeping track of everyone's beer. So why did beer become so deeply woven into early civilization? Because it solved multiple problems at once, completely by accident. It was safer than water. It was calorie-dense food in liquid form. It stored well. It could be used as payment. And it brought people together in a way plain water never really did. Some researchers even argue that the demand for reliable, fermentable grain may have helped push early humans toward farming in the first place, not purely for bread, but partly to keep the beer supply steady. An accident that may have helped drive an even bigger accident. Here's one final twist before we wrap up. Ancient beer looked nothing like the beer you'd recognize today. It was thick, cloudy, full of floating grain husks and bits of mash, closer to a fermented porridge than a clear drink. People often drank it through long reed straws, specifically to avoid sucking up all the solid grain debris floating on top. No glass bottles, no carbonation the way we know it. Just a thick, sour, slightly fizzy grain soup that quietly helped keep entire ancient societies alive. Even the flavor itself was an accident stacked on an accident. For most of history, beer wasn't flavored with hops at all. Brewers used a mix of random local herbs and spices called grut, whatever bittered or preserved the batch best. Hops only became the standard centuries later in medieval Europe, partly because monasteries found it happened to work better than most other options. By 1516, Germany even passed a law, the Reinheitsgebot, strictly regulating what beer was legally allowed to contain. An entire legal system, built centuries later, just to formalize a drink that began as spoiled grain mush nobody meant to make in the first place. Every modern brewery, every backyard barbecue, every stadium beer line on a Friday night, all of it traces back to one forgotten bowl of wet grain, left outside a little too long, that somebody drank anyway instead of throwing away. And once again, it wasn't a genius who figured this out. It was an accident, repeated enough times, by enough different people, that it eventually turned into one of the oldest habits in human history. If you want more videos on how ancient humans changed the world completely by accident, subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of story this channel is built on. And now I'm curious, what everyday food or drink in your kitchen right now do you think started out exactly like this, as a total accident nobody meant to make? Let me know in the comments. See you in the next one.